Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, our speaker is Dr. Ahmad Al-Khabbas, and his talk is Masculinity Transformations in Times of Unrest, a reading of Wannous' The Frightened Ones and Ibtisam, Trese's Cities of Pigeons. Before I present Dr. Khabbas, I would just like to say on behalf of Dr. Jihad, he unfortunately could not be with us, but he, of course, is very happy and pleased that one of his own students is presenting for Apetau's academic forum. And he considers Dr. Ahmad Al-Khabbas to be a very close friend and very good colleague. Dr. Ahmad Al-Khabbas is a colleague of ours at the English department. He received both his BA and MA at the University of Jordan. He then worked for his PhD at the State University of New York at Binghamton. His PhD, and I'm quoting from his abstract, is a study that investigates the poetics of post-colonial trauma in novels dealing with the authoritarian regime in Syria. He focuses on the voices of women to tell or show the representations of war narratives and how they develop. It gives me great pleasure today to present to you Dr. Ahmed Al-Khabbas. Dr. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for this introduction, Dr. Dina, and thank you so much on my behalf. Please thank Professor Jihad for showing our closeness, and thank you so again. Special thanks should go to Apetau for having or for giving me the chance to present like some of my work on or like to present some of my work. Before I get into to the depth of my talk, I just want to emphasize one thing. Like this talk is meant to be discussing the ins and outs of masculinity and how masculinity perception has transformed or has changed over time. And as you know, wars constitute a special and unique state that we need to ponder on when it comes to validating and materializing the ideals of patriarchy. When we think of masculinity, we think of ideals. Yet these ideals become under threat when wars break out and when conflicts start. And that's what the main argument in my talk is. Those concepts of masculinity and those ideals and pillars of masculinity get traumatized as well. So the whole idea of masculinity itself gets traumatized. We do not only have traumatized people, we do not only have traumatized individuals, we also have traumatized concepts. Those concepts do not go in a pattern or a paradigm of consistency. They keep fluctuating, they keep changing, and they keep oscillating between the present and the status quo over time. But before I start my talk, I need to give a synopsis or a summary of both texts. And I'm dealing with two texts, guys. The texts under scrutiny are two. The first one is entitled The Frightened Ones, and the second one is Cities of Pigeons, or Modern Imam by Ibtisam Trese. And those texts were written throughout or during the Syrian civil war, or the Syrian civil conflict, which erupted in 2011 out of the Arab Spring repercussions or consequences. In The Frightened Ones by Dima Wannous, and she's Saadallah Wannous' daughter, and the one who wrote حفل السمر من أجل 5 حزيران and الفيل يا ملك الزمان. This writer, and I'm going to start reading the synopsis of The Frightened Ones, and I'm going to move to reading the summary of The Frightened Ones so that we become on the same page. And I'm going to do it in short. The Frightened Ones, comprising 11 parts that do not go in chronological or linear order. Wannous, The Frightened Ones, presents the story of a traumatized daughter of a physician from Hama who moved to Damascus, fleeing the massacre that the regime committed in Hama. Sulaima, the distressed daughter, keeps reiterating the statement that I was 14 and I'm still, though she's in her 30s and she's heavily burdened with narrating the death of her father. Unable to articulate her inner wounds and recollect her traumatic memories, Sulaima gives the responsibility of the narration to Nassim, meaning he breathes in Arabic, to signal his fragility, enfeeblement, and rootlessness. Nassim, we know later, is just a mere creation of the traumatized narrator who is too burdened with the excruciating task of giving an account of her dying father, till he dies and leaves her brother Fuad, and her with themselves. The narrator dissociates herself from the recollections of her traumatizing memory and stands somehow aloof, leaving it for Nassim to narrate the story of the distressed Salma, not Sulaima. We're having two characters here, like Salma and Sulaima. But readers come to realization that Salma is in one way or another is Sulaima's herself. Though her fragmented process of recollection, the narrator introduces us to the huge spectrum of oppression, prejudice, and fear that Assyrians go through. Wannous introduces us to heart-wrenching stories for a variety of sufferings that permeate the whole novel, such as the story of Layla's brother, who was tortured till he became mentally disabled. She also hints at the idea that trauma caused by being ruled by an authoritarian regime does not only affect individuals, it also ruptures the whole society. Throughout the novel, Wannous provides a wide spectrum of massive damage that Hama massacre and the current civil war wreaked to the civilians and the socio-political scene in Syria. The novel opens up with a Fanonian spectrum in the sense that embodies Fanon's anticipations and cogitations on the condition of the colonized and demonstrates the vast annihilation that the colonization and oppression caused to the defense mechanisms of the mental apparatus and how they rupture those mechanisms. It starts with the protagonist's recollections of her visit to the clinic of a psychotherapist named Camille to help her control her panic attacks. But the war goes on. Fanon writes, but the wounds wreaked by the war or oppression are too pertinacious to be washed off from the tablets of memories. Wavering between two realms, Hamama's second Syrian civil war, Sulaima recollects her first visit to the small psychotherapist clinic in which tens of patients were suffocating the clinic. Few of them called in advance to schedule their appointments over a week ago, but most of them came out of emergencies. This clinic, as we note later, does not only treat those standing against the regime, but even the Shabih or the thugs, the narrator later says, are lining up among us, signaling the massive damage that the war caused to all parties involved in the Syrian war. Nassim later on abandons her and leaves his unfinished novel and migrates to Germany. She continues her wandering through the meandering wounds of Syrian people and places. She narrates the stories of oppressed people who greatly suffered and still do under the authoritarian regime of the Assad family. She alludes to the torture in the prisons, oppression practiced on opponents, and the rupture that the regime intentionally created to the ethnic fabric of the Syrian community via favoring Alawites over the other ethnic groups. She also narrates the story of those who went through enforced disappearance. At the end of the story, she returns back home to sit with her mother, who kept reading the same page in a book at page 24. We never know what title the book is, and her mother never flips beyond page 24. The events of the novel As the events of the novel unfold, we come to know why the narrative carries the title of The Frightened Ones. Fear becomes an infectious feeling that spreads to the whole community. Everyone there is fearing fear. And I'm going to give a synopsis or like a summary of Cities of Pigeons. Based on a real story, Cities of Pigeons is triggered by the arrest of the writer's son. His name is Noor. The narrative chronicles the story of a traumatized mother. The narrator's son was arrested by the regime because of his active role in helping smuggle food and medications to some of the besieged cities in Syria. Her son's disappearance becomes the starting point from which she explicates the Syrian suffering and the atrocious massacres and genocides that the regime commits against civilians. Her son becomes the catalyst of resistance for many of the Syrian people. At the same time, and out of no prior arrangement, the narrator finds herself joining a secret Facebook group of an anonymous persona called Hamdallah, a character which the caricaturist Najil Ali used as his signature on his own caricatures. Hamdallah, her son, and herself start narrating and incarnating the Syrian suffering in words. It is a story in which each chapter narrates accumulated wounds and prejudices those Syrians confronted during the Hama massacre and the civil war. The narrative keeps wandering around the Syrian cities, depicting and representing ailments and wounds of each city. Some cities were heavily shelled by the regime. Thousands still reside under the debris or the rubble. Others got their legs or arms amputated. Women were raped and slaughtered. The novel mainly focuses on the fact that the strategies that the regime used in the past and the present are still the same. The novel narrates the stories of those ailing Syrians who suffer from pertinacious and malicious grip of the merciless officers in the army or prisons. It also demonstrates how enforced disappearance breaks not only hearts but homes. For example, in the story of like Hayat, whose husband disappears, leaving his mother, daughter, and wife behind. She seduces her husband's little brother. The relationship results in the birth of a son, whom her husband thinks is his. Her husband disappears when he goes out to bring someone to help his wife deliver the baby, and he never comes back. The title itself, Cities of Pigeons, symbolic and allegorical. It symbolizes the murder of each trial towards peace that people undertake. These cities should not live in peace. These cities should stay vulnerable and weak, like those pigeons which cannot soar about without being targeted by shooters. The narrative ends up with stating the fact that Noor is still arrested and the mother is still waiting for him. So this is like a synopsis of the two novels in a question, and I'm going to give like the introduction about masculinity, its own rootedness and its establishment. Then I'm going to move out towards the analysis of the two chapters of the two novels in light of the masculine ideals. The conceptualization and materialization of masculinity hinges entirely on its strong contiguity with power. Masculinity throughout all times has been a construct laden with various historical and political implications. Man's presence is always correlated with his power, dominion, violence, protection, and dependence. Man has always been construed as the safeguard of the family and its stanch pillar, which provides protection and security to its establishment. And I'm quoting, constructions of masculinity and their influence on men's well-being. A theory of gender and health. Will Courtney draws upon the strong affinity between men's socially constructed ideals and health. Courtney contends that gender, and quoting, is constructed from cultural and subjective meanings that constantly shift and vary depending on the time and place. It becomes evident that culture and its establishment of ideas and their conceptualization play an integral part in the construction of what masculinity entails. Men normally strive to conform to those ideals and do their best to have those stereotypical constructs inscribed into their actions. Culture states ideals and individuals behave accordingly. The masculine ideals, which men strive to exemplify and embody, have been constantly changing over time. As long as societies change, these ideas keep changing. Rather, in spite of the fact that masculinity is a universal term, which patriarchal paradigms have constructed over time, there is no definite form of masculinity. In fact, multiple versions of masculinities exist. Valor, bravery, strength, and independence are among the most salient features determining what masculinity is. Yet, the long history of conflicts and colonialism in the Arab world has immediately affected the different trajectories masculinity went through. The constant defeats that Arabs went through, starting with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire and the mandate of both Britain and France on the Arab world, and the Israeli occupation of Palestine, have had debilitating effects upon the conceptualization of masculinity among Arabs. The majority of Arabs, and these days, still feel ashamed and enfeebled whenever they look retrospectively upon those moments of history in which they could neither defend their lands nor their dependents. A sense of self-resentment and remorse seep into them. When remembering those ailing moments, the defeat of Arab in the Six-Day War in 1967 intensified the dilemma of masculinity and its authenticity, since women themselves have started questioning the foundations of masculinity and its unearthed status when they saw those macho men falling apart and withdrawing from the social political scene, signaling their fragility and their inability to fend off their masculinity and prove its incredibility. In her groundbreaking monograph entitled Masculine Identity in the Fiction of the Arab East since 1967, Samira Agassi explores the intricate relationship between the recurrent historical defeats of Arabs went through and the vicissitudes in the conceptualization of masculinity. Agassi states, and I'm quoting, "The continuous rebuffs and the debacles in the area caused men a daunting sense of incompetence and ineffectiveness, demystifying and essentialized masculinity generally viewed as firm and stable. One might also safely say that masculinity is a malleable term that does not hold to a steady or firm nature. It is a paradigm that fluctuates and changes," and I'm quoting, "in accordance with the social, economic, political, and transformations in the area." In light of the above-mentioned polemics regarding masculinity and its discursive manifestations, the exploration of the status of masculinity in The Frightened Ones and City of Pigeons merits a close reading and investigation. In these novels, readers encountered many masculine characters: Camille, the psychotherapist; Nassim, the frightened writer who gives Sulaiman his latest unfinished work; Sulaiman's father, the physician who witnessed the Hammam massacre and escaped to Damascus out of fear and to flee the atrocities committed there; Fuad, the brother that regime abducts after his participation in demonstration and the husband of Sulaiman's aunt. Cities of Pigeons, we confront more masculine characters ranging from Abu Sa'id, the Palestinian refugee, the narrator's brother who returned from the prison, Mahmoud, the mentally ill character who was killed by the regime, and soldiers on whom I will concentrate in my elaboration and investigation of masculinity. The examination of masculinity in the novels will underscore the massive consequences of the conflicts upon the manifestation of masculinity and the transformations that it went through. Sulaiman's personal imagined encounters with Nassim, whose name means breeze in Arabic, significantly and importantly shows the various trepidations that he has been going through. Here, I'll be quoting at length one of those encounters, and I'm quoting. "We stood at the pavement adjacent to Camille's clinic. The clock hit 7 p.m. minutes ago, and there were some women, kids, and peddlers colonizing the sidewalks of the White Bridge, displaying their Chinese commodities and merchandise to passers-by. The noise stresses me. I hastened towards the street to stop a taxi. It took us a while to get on a taxi. He remained on his spot on the sidewalk, and I went ahead of him too easy to spy an empty cab amidst all that crowd. I seated myself at the back, and so did he. I wondered. Men normally seat themselves beside the driver, and for him, and I'm just reading now. Yeah, I wondered. Men normally seat themselves beside the driver, and for him to see himself at the back beside me is an act deemed deplorable by drivers. They construe it as an insult to their masculinity or like a self-humiliating demeanor if they meant no bad intention. Once we got settled in the back seat, I turned to the cab driver and said, "To Apetau, if you please." Nassim stealthily stretched out his hand to my hand and grabbed it while gearing his eyesight toward the window. He recklessly held my hand without even looking me in the eye. This quotation markedly demonstrates that Nassim undergoes some kind of social loneliness and indifference. The timing here is important because according to the Arabic conservative culture, a woman is not supposed to go out late at night unaccompanied. She was having company, but not the one she desires or society wants to see. It is the norm for a woman to be lagging behind when walking with men. Yet it is Sulaima who is walking ahead. It is Sulaima who stops the cab, not him. It is also like well nigh bizarre of him to get seated beside her in a conservative milieu. It is also Sulaima who tells the cab driver about their destination. All these indications communicate the fact that Nassim does not behave in a masculine way. In other words, he dares not to behave in a masculine way. In public, since he has lost all what makes him behave in a masculine manner. He even relegates himself to the status of a woman, having no audacity to sit beside the driver. He somehow thinks he's not worthy of being labeled with masculine feature. He takes no initiative. Strikingly, Nassim does not seem to get aroused when he grabs like Sulaiman's hand. For Nassim to see himself at the back seat beside Sulaiman stimulates readers' curiosity and conjures up the devil within themselves, presuming that they will be encountering like an erotic scene. In their monograph entitled "The Male Ordeal, Role Crisis in a Changing World," Eric and Richard Rabkin say that, and I'm quoting, "Men do still make almost all the first moves in dating and courtship. According to available studies, women may sometimes expedite or engineer those moves by making themselves available, responding with a special vivaciousness to a particular man's causal tensions, contriving apparently impersonate reasons to otherwise interact with them, and so on. But even in singles, bars where the people are present ostensibly to meet members of the opposite sex, women almost universally wait for men to initiate contact. Exuberantly, Nassim fulfills the first part when he does initiate physical contact with her, and she, in return, succumbs to his courtship initiative via tightly holding his hand, as an indication of her willingness to let him enjoy the moment. But he's too timid to finish what he started and does not dare to look at her in the eye, signaling his inability to express his sexual interest in her. In fact, they both never get any physical relationship throughout the whole novel. They never kiss or flirt with each other. They have no sexual intercourse. They only had like one intimate moment in which he was delicate as a breeze. His hand even reached out to her face, fumbled her cheeks, and played with her returning it behind her ears. She felt calm and serene, as if she never felt so before. He held all her body and planted her in his chest intimately, and pressing towards his chest, He embraced her as if felicity engulfed her. But alas, this moment in which he embraced her was a dream. He was only dreaming. This also indicates that the impotence and void, which Nassim literally feels and it represents, a feeling of worthlessness permeates the novel. In the first part of the novel, two women encounter Nassim. Or would it be more accurate to say that Nassim has confrontations with two women, Layla, Camille's secretary, and Suleima, the narrator. Interestingly, his encounters with both women go or like operate differently. When he entered the clinic and seated himself on the vacant chairs, Nassim lit a cigarette and started to recklessly throw the ash on the floor as a signal of his superiority or disinterest to what others might think of him. No one stops him or even like draws his attention to the fact that there is an ashtray placed at the table, except the secretary who, with an imperative tone, told him that there is an ashtray on the table in front of you. It is evident that Layla truly knows who this man with bulging muscles is. He's a man shaken to the core. Otherwise, he wouldn't even dare to use the imperative tone with him and without a politeness or without any politeness phrase such as excuse me or please. Nassim unexpectedly succumbs to Layla's demand because he well knows that Layla's cognizant of the fact that if he was doing well, he would not come to the clinic to be seen by a psychotherapist. It is stigmatizing for an individual to seek mental health care. This is like what most people in the Arab world believe in. The second woman whom he encounters is Suleima, whom he hypnotized with his narcissistic appearance. Suleima is like mourning the loss of her father. This also indicates that she lost the fatherly protection and care. By turning to Nassim, she thought that this tough man, might provide her some solace or support to help her alleviate her loneliness and overcome her fear. Being a new patient herself without, well, knowing who Nassim is or why he came to the clinic, Suleima pinned so many hopes on him. She thought that his ambiguity might hide an exceptional charisma. She even meekly and submissively obeyed his invitation and never argued with him or asked him about his name. After several weeks of going out and without knowing anything about each other, Suleima realized that all community of her society are sharing the same trait, fear. Then and only then she articulates her pity and sympathy for him, feeling an inner desire to hug this strange man. It is the same fear that combines and even binds all people in the novel together. The exposition of these two confrontations reflect the writer's manifestation of women's viewpoint towards diminishing masculinity and the way women react to it. Wannous' reflection of the opposition of masculinity shows that women have two different standpoints toward men's reactions to the tyrannical and practices that the regime exercises upon them. Layla, on the one hand, represents those women who think that men should not, or women should, hold to the patriarchal ideas that compels them to be actively involved in the formation of the political scene, no matter what the cost is. Aligned with Layla is Suleima's mother, who keeps admonishing and reprimanding her husband for his cowardice when Hammam massacre occurred, since he was just left his people behind and moved to Damascus. Suleima's aunt also represents this type of women, and she became the breadwinner of her family. Suleima, on the other hand, approaches the issue differently. She somehow unearths the underlying reason behind men's withdrawal from their socially constructed ideals, believing that the regime has wreaked enough damage to the construct of masculinity, as if we take into consideration Agassi's viewpoint that dictators represent the patriarch, which not only subjugate men, but emasculate men who oppose the regime. When notices the frightened ones and cities of pigeons shed a more focused light upon two opposing polarities. On the one hand, Men as subject to power represented the regime and its operating polities, such as intelligence, army, informants, police. On the other hand, it also explicates men as objects of violence and humiliation strategies, which the regime practices in order to guarantee that the civilians will be haunted by fear of for the rest of their lives. Those views towards masculinity will be elaborated as the argument proceeds. And I'm going to skip like a few passages. In the first part of the novel, Nassim develops a habit of face slapping. Culturally speaking, in accordance to Arabic culture, face slapping is a feminine feature to which women resort to articulate their deep sorrow, bereavement, and grief. This habit is not masculine, it's not a masculine trait. Yet Nassim's formation of this destructive tendency indicates how much turmoil, misery, and fragility he carries within himself. Slapping also symbolizes a loss reaction as incarnated in the form of mourning and lamentation. We later know that Nassim is from Homs, a city which the regime placed under siege for almost 3 years. During those years, the regime cut off all aids and assistance from coming into the city. The soldiers wreaked havoc and vandalism on the entire city. In a heart-wrenching description of the damage the regime, soldiers, and thugs did to the city, Wannous writes, their house, as most of the other properties, was viciously looted and vandalized by the thugs and soldiers. She said they stole all the furniture. They even uninstalled the bulbs and took them away. They even used an iron to take off the restroom tiles. They even preyed on the windows, lattices, and banisters. They did so because of the Emir's board has recently opened a steel factory. This quotation surely marks the volume of damage wreaked the properties of homes. A house damage does not solely mean the collapse of physical objects or demolition. Now, in a house resides memories and identities. It is the place which gender ideas are materialized. It is the house in which Nassim could have lived and experienced his masculine behavior. The collapse of his house indicates a form of emasculation that intensifies his anxiety and insecurities.
Dr. Ahmad,
Yeah, I'm going to skip to the last
I
section.
just want to say that you have 10 more minutes, and then we're
Sure,
going to open the floor to questions.
sure. Just give me 1 second. As far as masculinity is concerned, it's worth investigating the character of Suleiman's father. For us to better understand the complex dilemma of the father who escaped the Hammam massacre, it would be important to investigate his character in light of the poetics of survivor's syndrome. Sometimes to suffer death is more acceptable than living with an endless feeling of helplessness and betrayal. Trauma survived develops a feeling of guilt and shame over time. It is the guilt that symbolizes the victim's inability to resist and defend himself or herself. It also signals the absence of taking a stand and the constant reaffirmation of passivity and submission. In From Guilt to Shame, Ruth Lays elaborately investigates survivor's guilt and extensively examines its consequences upon individuals. Lay states that according to Netherlands and others, survivor guilt was the product of massive psychic regression in concentration camp victims as they tried to cope with the brutality and terror of the camps. The claim was that after an initial period of shock, disorientation, and depersonalization, prisoners survived robotization, automatization of psychic functions involving a mesmerized suppression of self-reflection, volition, and judgment. I'm skipping some quotations. This quotation pointedly highlights the drastic consequence of identification with the aggressor on the survivor. Developing enigmatic feelings towards other traumatized people is another aftermath that trauma survivors cannot easily get rid of. This strongly relates to the character of Sulaiman's mother in The Frightened Ones, who shows no empathy with the traumatized father, or Nassim, the traumatized writer, and the character of Sitt al-Husn in Cities of Pigeons. In spite of the fact these two characters are trauma survivors themselves, they still live their own identification with the aggressor and show no sympathy with other trauma survivors. The mother constantly reproaches the father, who happens to be a physician, and Sitt al-Husn, who shows no mercy upon the girls whom the Shabiha detained for torture and rape. But it is important to point out that the father's identification with the aggressor takes a different form and is reflected differently upon the character of the father. Wannous writes, "My father was a stranger. I do not mean that he had been a freak. He lived his isolation away from what surrounds his flesh and skin. He was always immersed in silence, pondering on his life from the taxi's window, passing as if he were reflecting on his own destiny. He feared cold, a runny nose, as well as a sore throat. He fears traveling and moving from one place to another. He fears crowds and huge congregations exhaust him." This quotation clearly reflects a huge deal of fear that her father goes through, though he is a physician himself and well knows that those illnesses are not risky and quickly heal up. This markedly tells that he has a devastated psyche that is created by fear. Cities of Pigeons, Trese or Tracy's, draws our attention to another form of traumatized masculinity. It is the ruptured masculinity of the soldiers who became stripped of their arms and weapons. This is well understood, like when we see that Trese stressed the importance of guns in developing person's sense of masculinity, power, and control. The weapons that a soldier holds or soldiers hold around their waists or upon their shoulders markedly show their complete reliance on them for them to live and represent their authoritative role. In Cities of Pigeons, we find that this clientelist system incarnated in the practices that thugs and soldiers commit against helpless civilians who have nothing to do with ongoing political unrest in the country. Thugs and soldiers forcibly take control of houses and occupy them. Once they enter a city, they evacuate it and occupy the undemolished houses and buildings for their own use. And I'm skipping the quotation like about a soldier like who was behaving at ease, like after robbing like one of those houses, and then this quotation emphatically says the notion that those soldiers have vehemently abused power that were given by the regime itself to them by the regime itself. That also exposes the soldiers' proclivity for vandalism and destruction. They intentionally sabotage and vandalize the whole place so that others would not even benefit from its wood. The old man's reaction reflects the huge fear he suffers from when seeing armed soldiers. He even gives his own pack of cigarettes to the soldiers without any hesitation or reluctance. He just wants to be safe and stay alive. Crying is another sign that echoes the horrible situation and condition which the old man goes through. It also bespeaks the historical fear that civilians developed when seeing an army soldier. They associate the soldier with oppression, violence, and trespassing. How much time do I have, Dr. Dino? Can I have 2 more minutes?
Yeah, sure. You can have 5 more minutes if you want.
Sure. No. Arms and weapons for a soldier represent the sexualized phallus and signal his macho character. Arms make the soldier and soldier are just mere like cowardly human beings without them. Trese writes, "The enemy does not chase the warrior himself. Rather, he targets his weapon because it is the reason and the tool which made him a warrior. Without it, he will be only like A lonely and helpless creature standing on the edge of a roof, waiting to be shot by an enemy, hiding somewhere, or to be targeted by a bullet fired by one of his colleagues who are like centering somewhere else. It's not true that a soldier can give up on his own weapon and run away. His existence heavily hinges upon his secretive adornment with his weapon. He will never give up on it because his bravery resides within it. Here, Trese draws the picture of a resilient soldier whose strength is derived from the weapons he carries. The soldier vehemently kills others and indirectly frightens the old man in the kiosk, only because of the weapons he has. The soldier has also shamelessly rapes the warm body of a young kid whom he just killed. These soldiers ravage around just because of their arms. Yet it is important to stress the notion that the moment in which the soldier places his weapons aside to rape the body of a child, that causes his downfall. Once he took off his pants and finished raping the kid, the soldier became stripped of all that makes him seem a brave man. He became an easy target for the kid's faithful dog, which frantically barked at him. The soldier then ran away to the fields, leaving his arms behind. Even the narrator wonders and questions, how did he give up on his own weapons? Then and only then will he realize that his lust will put an end to his life. Here he is harmless. Instead of loading his gun, he himself became loaded with fear. He ends up running in the endless fields, not realizing that he was shot and bleeding. Rather, he became the coward hostage chained to a bed just because he gave up on his own weapons. And now I'm going to read the conclusion. The narratives discuss the meticulous observation of the two novels in a question show that the narratives discuss and investigate the concept of masculinity. The narratives show that conflicts and wars have had an immense effect on masculinity in times of war machinery. The works under scrutiny shed a more focused light upon the meandering transformations that the concept undergoes in times of war and distress. The narratives with images of frightened and cowardly men in a way that reverses the traditional conceptualization of what masculinity is or entails. Both narratives draw a horrifying image of the socially constructed masculinity in a way that compels readers to reconsider what masculinity really is. They offer unconventional representations of men who either live with an endless state of shame till the very last breath of their lives, or men encroached in their own shell of fear. Even macho soldiers who brag about their invincible prowess became helpless captives chained with a metal chain to the end of a metal bed, signaling their castration. Some characters even aim for the socially assigned gender roles that they are deprived of, as noticed in Nassim's behavior, who tries to let Suleima follow him with a hint, but alas, he is too damaged to be consistent with expressing his distorted sense of masculinity and easily succumbs to his helplessness. He even breaks down. He even writes obituaries for people who are not dead yet. The heavy shackles, political unrest, and mental breakdowns that these men undergo make them kneel down to these circumstances and undergo a state of social and biological castration. We see Suleima's father, who desires imagined women with whom he never had an interaction, but they do not know that he is a physician who escaped the Hammam massacre and did not help his friends and relatives. We also encounter the narrator's brother who comes back from the prison of the regime, completely debilitated, to the extent that he sleeps most of the time on the couch in the living room, leaving his wife alone in their bedroom. But the mother feels sorry for him and unlocks the room in which his father used to sleep, in signaling her empathy with her damaged son. And I think I'm done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad. We are going to answer some questions for the next 20 minutes. If anyone has a question, they can raise their hand. We may take 2 or 3 together, and then Dr. Ahmed will answer them accordingly. We have first question from Professor Ghanem. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Dina.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for a beautiful presentation of the topic. I'm
Thank
really
you so much.
delighted. And I'm especially delighted with the balance and the focus on the two sides of the comparison, the two works. This is very important in comparisons. In fact, if we listen to a summary of the work, possibly would not be able to tell where the researcher stands because of the very few words or terms used to reveal Dr. Ahmed's stand. I know it's very difficult to remain unbiased. I mean, taking into consideration that we belong to the culture of the two novels and we have our own personal attitudes. However, I cannot claim that Dr. Ahmed has shown any sort of bias. No, on the contrary, there was a sort of balance, and this is another thing to commend in the work of Dr. Ahmed. In fact, in some places when I was listening, I was a little bit unsure whether the argument being advanced is the argument of Dr. Ahmed or the argument in the works themselves. So this is why possibly I need to read the whole paper of Dr. Ahmed to decide upon. However, it was a wonderful contribution to our field of study, Dr. Ahmed. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Ghanem. In fact, I think my voice resides in choosing those novels under scrutiny, because both works advocate and admonish and call for an outcry for protesting and fighting oppression and dictatorship. So I think my voice resides somewhere between the lines of fighting oppression wherever it exists. That's why these days I'm writing some research on Gaza and how double standards permeate through the whole setting of how they see Palestinian lives these days. This is, I think, this is one aspect. The other aspect, it is both. The argument is ours. It's both. And I know the author of one of the novels in person here at Ibtisam, Trese, and she traveled out of Syria because of the regime has tried to capture and to imprison her. And she lives somewhere else, and that's why the tone, the discourse, I think, are collaboratively intertwined between the researcher and the works under scrutiny, Professor Ghani.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for your insightful comments and contribution. Thank you, Professor Ghani.
Thank you, Professor. Any more questions? No? Well, while our audience comes up with any questions, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
We've been for the last maybe 50 days, I don't know, maybe more than 50 days, watching the events that take place in Gaza, and I couldn't help but think or wonder if what you are arguing in your research or in this paper that you just presented today, if when you're watching the news or you're watching snippets of the massacres that are taking place in Gaza, if this idea of you called it transformative masculinities, I think, or
Transformation.
or traumatic masculinities. I mean, do you see
Traumatized, yeah, masculinity.
do you see that happening? Do you see that happening when you're watching the news?
In
or
fact,
watching
I think
events?
there is a strong affinity between my research and what is happening, Dr. Dina, these days. And I think when we see the resistant men approaching vehicles and military equipments closely, I think this is changing our concept of heroism these days.
Mhm.
What
What is
heroism
that?
is.
What is it that you see that's changing the concept of heroism?
The concept of heroism, when those resistant men,
Yeah.
from those resistant groups are approaching physically and too closely those vehicles, it changes our perception of what heroism is, because this generation has been trying fed up with the idea or the concept that heroism, digital cartoons and stuff, those are coming up with the heroic imaginary actions. But these ones are bringing up heroic actions. They're lively. I
Yeah.
think this also changes what heroism is, not only masculinity. The other point is it's an anecdote. And I was having a conversation, a friendly conversation with a friend of mine 2 weeks ago about what's going on in Gaza, and he's enlisted in the military army. And he told me Ahmad, if you feel that you're castrated, you feel that you're helpless, the situation is doubled for me because I know how to use weapons and I cannot use them.
Mhm.
And this intensifies my own dilemma and complexities that I'm going through. I'm wrestling with it, Ahmed. If you feel that you're feeling castrated, you cannot do anything, the situation for me is more complex. I can use it. I know how to throw rockets. I know how to use weapons. I know how to drive a tank, and I cannot use it. And this gets me into a halo of helplessness, enfeeblement, and disappointment as well. Hope I answered your question, Dina.
Yeah, it is interesting what you're saying. I think also, even the concept of heroism is changing. We're seeing, heroism has always been, of course, kind of like a value or a characteristic of men, but now in what's happening in Gaza, we can see children practice, these acts of heroism. We can see women practicing these acts of heroism. So it is, I think that's an interesting thing that you just said about how the definition of heroism is really changing and altering in very different ways because of the things that we're seeing happening today, and because of the trauma that people in Gaza are under.
It does not negate the fact that they're being severely traumatized these
Yeah,
days.
that's true.
Does
We
not
have,
negate.
yeah, that's true. It's a really interesting area of interest, and it's interesting to think about as well. Ilham,
And as if you've noticed, Gazans are using dark humor as a self defense mechanism for their trauma.
yeah, that's
if you know
true.
Abu, the one who keeps saying iced coffee.
Yeah,
Oh, it's iced coffee, situation, as we say, in awesome, tagia, tamam, whatever, it's not.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your contribution, Dr. Dina.
Thank you. Ilham, we have Ilham who has raised her hand, and it seems like she has a question. Go ahead, Ilham.
Assalamu alaikum. يعطيكم العافية, both
Allah
Dr.
ya'afiki.
Dima and Dr. Ahmad. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. My question, Dr. Ahmad, I mean, from my research, personal research, and also readings, I usually find that another topic is usually discussed whenever we talk about oppression against men. The topic is basically about women being subjected to double the oppression, meaning colonization or oppression caused by power, as well as when this happens to men, they usually take it on women. We have this kind of double oppression that women are usually presented to be subjected to. I'm not familiar with these two novels, so I was wondering if this theme was present anywhere in the two novels. Thank you.
Sure. First of all, in the beginning of my research was about like to highlight the notion that this is a literature by women. So in other sense, like we're having women who are voicing their own voices about the whole situation in Syria. This like adds up to the whole like spectrum of writings discussing war and violence. That's number one. The second point is, yes, we were having lots of feminist like readings, feminist approaches, feminist appropriations of the texts. Layla's mother, for example, like Suleiman's mother, was having or like suffering from a sectarian oppression because she's Sunni, her father is Alawite, and every time like when she meets up her like sisters and brothers-in-law, every time they will say this to her, ريت الرحم اللي ولدك يبلع بالسرطان. Mean that womb which has had it in you like maybe afflicted with cancer, just because she's an Alawite, just because she's from like Sunni. And at the same time, like we were having lots of oppression going around in both novels. The mother herself, even like women themselves, did not like the gender roles that they were assigning. They just wanted the peace of mind. They just wanted to get rid of oppression of men and women at the same time. So we have lots of examples like feminist approaches that you can approach the text like with, but at the same time, we just focused on how men were like oppressed and how men were having a transformational state of masculinity. Yet, but feminism existed, and we have lots of examples that show and testify to the notion that those like characters were oppressed doubly by the regime itself and by men around them. But at the same time, like it is noticeable that we have also lots of strong women because men are absent from this scene. Like when men are not really like active and present there. That's why like we have lots of strong women, like Layla's mother, for example, or Sulaiman's mother. She's a very like a masculine mother. She does not even like cry when her son gets abducted just because she wants to wash off the stigmatizing history of the father. Hope this answers your query or like question, Mr. Ilham.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Any more questions? Any more questions? You know, this idea of, we do have a question. Okay, Claire, go ahead.
Yes, Professor. Actually, I don't have a question. Just I want to thank you, and I would like to thank Professor Al-Khabbas, smart professor, for this nice topic. God bless you all. Thank you for giving us this lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you.
And
That's
like you
very
were a
nice of you.
graduate and I taught you in one of the classes and you're a diligent, hardworking student. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you, Professor. God bless you.
Thank you. I have a question about, you know, the history of masculinity and the ways that masculinity, because obviously you're telling us that these roles have been reversed between men and women, it seems. Am I right or am I incorrect? Yeah. I mean, how far back does this go into the, I mean, I know, for instance, you know, in the 18th century, there's a text by Cavendish that talks about, you know, flipping the roles of men and women. So I'm wondering how far back in the history of English literature does you know, this concept of masculinity or these texts that show how men and women sort of change places with the gender roles. I mean, how far back can we go and see that in the history?
I think some historians and intellectuals refer it back to the religious texts as well. Like when religion tries to give priority to men over women, and at the same time they try like to empower men more and more. And I think like most like intellectuals, historians try to refer it back to the same like very story of the creation of Adam and Eve.
Okay.
Once they like they were like dropped down to earth and they were like suffering after like they beget so many kids, and like after like Abel and Cain killed each other, like fought each other. So I think it goes back, like if we roll back the curtains of time, it goes back to the beginnings of time. I think
Yeah,
so.
it seems so. Yeah, it seems so. So do we have any more questions? Any more questions or comments or nope? We have Lubna. Okay, this is going to
We
be our
have
last
Lubna.
question. Lubna Khalid, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Actually,
So-
thank you, Dr. Ahmad, for this seminar. And thank you,
Oh, thank you
Dr.
so much, Lubna, for attending.
Yes, actually, this novel, I'm interested for this novel. And at the same time, I watch a lecture for literature or any topic about literature. I have just one comment question, Doctor. Masculinity is an integral part from God's wisdom. So we are not need masculinity as we need men in our life. Maybe most of the women are weak, so we need the strong men to save the world, as we say in Gaza. Actually, this heroic war and heroic thing we watch it. It's so amazing at the same time. So thank you for this topic, and inshallah I will realize more for this literature because
Sure.
most
Thank you
of
so much,
meaning I
Lubna,
can't
for
understand
attending.
that.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Lubna, for attending.
Thank you, Doctor.
Sure.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Lubna.
much.
Any more questions? Any more questions? So if our audience doesn't have any more questions, I'd like to wrap up today's session and thank Dr. Ahmad Khabbas for this very insightful and very informative talk. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees. This talk will be available on YouTube probably today or tomorrow. So if any of you would like to watch it again, you can go to our YouTube channel where we have all of our sessions available. And on behalf of Dr. Jihad, he could not be with us today. I'd like to thank you all again for coming, and I'd like to thank Dr. Ahmad Al-Khabbas for presenting. And I hope to see you, and Apetau's family, of course, hopes to see you again in January. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, all of you. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.